So hello everyone and welcome back to Reinventing Real Estate. This is episode 8 and we're incredibly excited to be delving into the evolving world of co-living today. And we have our amazing guest Anil with us. He has incredible experience in the co-living sector, longer than most, for around over 7 years. And Anil's journey is a really interesting one as he came from a rich background in real estate, including nearly 11 years at Blackstone. So having that real investor insight and then founding his own company, Node. So we're incredibly excited to be delving into the world of Node and co-living. They now have assets in the US, the UK, Dublin and Spain. So looking at co-living from a kind of global aspect as well as looking at domestically.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Anil, it's just always so interesting to hear from you. And I think when we have conversations together, I'm personally always so fascinated by the background that you came from and obviously your Blackstone days and jumping from what's obviously this mega fund into the creation of a really exciting, innovative brand that's taking the global co-living market by storm. So I think we'd love to hear a bit more about kind of the background of obviously you starting out and being at Blackstone and then transitioning into sort of such a different role and how that all happened, really.
Yeah, to me, you really have to step back even further. And it's about what did you want to be when you were a kid and when you grew up? And what did you do with your spare time? And I used to draw floor plans.
You know? Love it.
That's so great.
But I also used to like investments. I looked at Wall Street Journal equivalents and had a foot into business, a foot into design. So when I thought about what do you do as a career, I thought, oh, should I be an architect? Should I be a civil engineer? Should I be like a real estate investor agent? It was a bit of all of that, right? And so I ended up in a career in the investing world in real estate, starting at an investment bank and then into private equity very soon. But it all came back to enjoying the aesthetics of real estate, enjoying designing buildings, creating things, but liking the financing and the numbers around that into one. So in a way, the Blackstone journey in real estate was really part of that in the sense of you're still designing buildings, but you're more focused on the finance side and the numbers. And I think I just had an itching to then execute on that sort of childhood experience of, okay, maybe you become too senior and you're focused on a certain part of the business. And you're like, yeah, but what about like actually how to design these buildings and build them? And we were involved in building some buildings right behind us in Shoreditch. And I was always interested in those design meetings, et cetera. And it's good to come back to what you felt like was a hobby turned into a profession. And for me, it is quite natural that they were great stepping stones. And it was great having not only 11 years at Blackstone in London, but also starting my career at another real estate firm in California. So having a foot into the U.S., that mentality as well as Europe, and then worked in Asia a little bit as well as part of that.
And it's really interesting you mentioned the US because obviously that is a totally different way of thinking. And I think in the UK, often culturally, it's much slower or more kind of stiff in thinking, and co-living is definitely a sort of slight leap of faith for people. There's a lot of people in the market now that are just totally getting co-living, and clearly there's a massive need for the sector in so many different ways. But how do you think that sort of US approach influenced the formation of Node, or did it, or your strategy in general?
It definitely did, but I think how you execute things are different in Europe versus North America. The U.S. has a very mature multifamily market. So there's a lot of urban apartments that are out there. It's been around for a while. They've had an established market. There's scale there. So there's a lot of people and they've had a good ride. So there's a lot of people like, hey, I've been doing this for 30 years. Why break something or why fix something that's not broken type of mentality? And they've been able to ride that wave of just population growth, demographic shift, et cetera. But they hadn't really picked up on the consumer need for a bit more living in community, optimizing space, having a plug-and-play concept that's more turnkey. And so those are new things for the U.S. market, and sometimes it's actually harder to innovate in a market that's done well and being well established with a different ethos. So you're kind of knocking on doors that might not be as interested, and it takes a little while for those doors to open. Whereas I think if you come to Europe, we've been used to being in urban environments, walking more, using transport, being in smaller spaces, wanting to go out, and there is more of a furnished market. So people want that, but they want a better version of it. And so I think people were more open to it as the concept, first of all. We have more urbanized cities here than in the U.S. There's still a lot of people who need to drive. There's probably 2 or 3 cities only where you can do things without a car. And so when you think about buildings and micro living, it's not as easy as to execute that. So I do think there's a slightly different version that you would apply to Canada and the U.S. in certain cities. And where you are in the cities, it could be different. So if you're right in the center of one of the 2 big cities, New York or San Francisco or Toronto, that have good transport links, where you could have a more European urban life, there's probably a co-living model that could be more similar to what we see in London or Barcelona or Madrid or Dublin. But then you have these other cities, if you're in Nashville or you're in these other growing cities that still have a demographic that want these elements of community, but you need a car more often to go out. You need these other things. So it would be a slightly different version of how you would do co-living.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think being in that kind of dense urban city environment is so ripe for co-living in so many different ways. And I think tapping into that just makes perfect sense. And I think reflecting on your journey and your aspirations from growing up, and obviously your creativity and how you really embraced the real estate sector from such a young age, what would be the lessons that you would almost give to yourself now, knowing what you do and obviously building such a successful business as you have, in retrospect saying, well, how would you start up again? What would be the lessons to you now if you were in that position right now?
No, it's a great question. I brought in a partner halfway through this sort of 7-8 year journey, and we were both doing very similar things and got on and decided to come together. But I do think there's strength in starting with a business partner from the get-go. I think someone to bounce ideas off of and just share that. Now, my wife and my sister were involved in the business, so we had it a bit like a family business. So it's not that we didn't have any of that, but I do think there's strength in that, and I think it creates more resilience for the company. It's not a one-person show. You've got some resilience there. Having good mentors is always good, and having advice from people from different industries. I did that a little later on the journey, and we were talking about it earlier, but actually getting insights from people who've done something different. But you find the journey is so similar, especially just being an entrepreneur. And it's a steep learning curve. Like, it's very different coming from a private equity or one of those types of corporate backgrounds, whether it's private equity, a real estate investment firm, a consulting firm, where it's full of a lot of very smart people and you get a lot of very polished things, and it's quite process oriented, and you pick a specialism within that and you tend to do really well and you feel good about yourself, and oh, that's great. But I think when you get in the real world and you're a generalist and you have to deal with all sorts of people from all sorts of life, it's quite humbling. And all the things you don't know that you weren't trained for when you were a specialist, it was like, great, but now you have to fill in the gaps of your own weaknesses. So I think self-learning is really important as well. I probably should have listened more in my marketing or branding class. I didn't think I'd create a brand when I was in undergrad business school. I was like, it's all this fluffy stuff.
You've done pretty good, to be honest.
So I was slacking off there. So it's always, it's those blind spots. I would say to people, it's like the things you don't know are the ones that catch you later. The things you're good at, you know that, and you're running with it. But how do you round out the weaknesses in your skill set? And everyone's going to have a weakness somewhere. That's how we're built. If we have really good strengths, we're going to have areas that we're not as good at. And it comes down to personality typing and, what your talents are. So I would definitely advise myself, bring more people around you, bring some few different perspectives around you, have more mentors, have a partner. I think those are definite lessons learned.
Yeah, and I think what you said is totally right, because one of the main things that I think I've learned is know what you don't know and be able to lean into that. And I think you saying that you can learn from so many different sectors that aren't real estate, because real estate sometimes does have blinkers on or is hyper specialized, and there's a certain modus operandi when it comes to a way of thinking. So there is so much more out there in the universe. Yeah. I think we're really passionate about brand and creativity and kind of bringing that into the sector, but there's so much more: technology, AI, and everything else. So it's knowing what you know and knowing more about what you don't know in order to enrich what you're doing moving forward. And I think obviously that's such a key lesson.
Yeah, and I think even like we talk about this a lot about And clearly Node has this kind of in its DNA, but hospitality, and how do you look beyond, like you say, your own sector and get inspired by what's going on within other sectors. And I think that's a really important part of the puzzle that is often missed and now is getting a bit more attention. Companies like yours have had that, I think, from the beginning, that these people are customers, not just tenants. What do they need from us? And when we were talking the other day, said something really nice about the mission to give people a better place to live. And I think looking at it from that point of view actually opens up to how you can be inspired and improve your offering by opening your eyes and ears to what else is out there and what else the other sectors are doing really well that can be lent into and borrowed, specifically, I think, for all the living sectors.
A bit of a random question, but we like to sometimes ask, what title would you give to this chapter of your life? That's a very hard one to answer, I know.
No, it's easy. I would say the roller coaster.
Love it.
Yeah. So
in what sense?
Well, just a lot of things moving around. You're going left, you're going right. There's some really exciting ups. Look, we've come out of a pandemic. We're going through about a bunch of political changes in 3 of the 5 countries we're operating right now. So there's a lot in flux, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of uncertainty. It's going to create some really interesting opportunities, but it's also going to create some challenges, right? And hence the roller coaster. And then on the personal side, doing that with a couple kids that are young and having a foot in a life in North America and in Europe, there's lots going on, right? So it's an exciting roller coaster ride, but it's definitely a ride.
I
think
like that.
That's also a really important thing for people to understand more from like a founder perspective, and that's why we love having founders on the podcast as well, is that true journey from kind of inception to now. And I think that idea of the roller coaster really sums it up really nicely, because I think a lot of the time people see your successes and they don't realize the journey that it's taken to get there. So I think it's a really important one to emphasize, especially when we have founders on the show, that you guys have been on years of this journey, and it isn't always incredible moments and highs, and it is that kind of ebbs and flows, but amazing to have got here now and established what you've established in the market.
I think what's amazing is how quickly you've grown from 7 years ago. Let's be honest, 7 years is not that long, especially when you've had the pandemic, the economic uncertainty of recent times, and everything else that's been going on with Brexit, et cetera, et cetera. If you were to look at yourself 2, 3, 4 years ago and then look at yourself today, what's the kind of main thing that you think, I wouldn't necessarily have expected that to happen, but has happened?
Yeah, I think some of the scale of the projects we're doing. Now, I come from a scale background. I worked on a project that was 1,204 beds right behind us, but I didn't expect to be opening nodes of that scale or size and seeing the opportunity. I didn't expect to see this as big of a global movement as it's become. That's been a big thing, just meeting people around the world. We're into this, like, this is the future, this is the way people are living. It's just, we caught on to a trend. I think we felt the way people need to live needs to change because they want to change, but there were these barriers to do it. I'm pleasantly surprised in a really good way that actually this whole thing came. I didn't think we were going to create a co-living company. I told John Gray, my boss at Blackstone, look, I'm trying to figure out where you go after student living. You're a young professional, you're creative, you're moving city to city, you want a nice place to live, you want a community, you want something turnkey, you want to meet people, and it feels a bit aspirational, but you're on that budget. And I didn't have a name for it. And then this co-living idea or movement resurfaced. And so these debates, are we a co-living company? Are we furnished? What do we call it? But I think there's been a lot of debate about what's co-living called. How do you define it? Is it sharing, 4 people sharing an apartment? Is it someone living in a micro apartment? But I think for us, it was like co-working. It was like the ethos. It's turnkey. It's community-based. There's something more than the bricks and sticks, right? It's a lifestyle product, and that's what we like about co-living. It's a lifestyle approach. It's a hospitality approach. It's a more personal design journey approach to it. And yeah, I was coming back to your question. I was really encouraged seeing, we're part of a movement in a way. And so we and it's a collaborative movement. It's not a zero-sum one. There's enough room for people to play it. If you want to do a small scale rural concept, great. If you want to do a large scale urban, great. If you want to do luxury, if you want to do eco, if you want to do, there's so many things. It's fun. I think that's what's going to make the world a little bit more interesting in our cities, right? You can pick and choose a bit more than just a flat to rent, on the high street, right? So I'm encouraged by that. So those are things that I didn't know when we thought about 7 years, what was this going to become?
I think, ultimately people live in so many different ways, and therefore you can cater to different pockets of people. And that's what is exciting about co-living. And I think, as you say, it doesn't necessarily need to be known as co-living. It's just a flexible way of living in environments with a sense of community and with enhanced experience. And I think that's what you clearly do so well.
So you touched on it a bit before, but I suppose it'd be amazing to really identify when you thought about co-living as a concept and when you decided that was going to be that was going to be the concept that you were going to run with.
So I had a really good friend, and she started her career at the same university in Canada, moved to the UK, moved to LA, moved to New York, Hong Kong, Zug, and we were overlapping in a few cities at the time. And I always saw the issues she had moving to different cities. And she said, Neil, where do I go here? Where do that? I'm in this place. And I really felt that women were having a harder time in their journey, moving to cities for their careers, coming out of school. Of course, everyone has friends and this and that, but just safety, community, something that appeals aesthetically, an approach to being in an environment that's neighborly but still private. And I really just felt that we need something that caters to that clientele demographic. And so outside of co-living or anything else, I was like, that's what we're going to have our business about. That's what it's about. And we come from a male-dominated industry. When I was at my first investment fund, it was all men. Blackstone used to be like that. It's very different now. When it started, when it had 60, I was the 69th person there. It was very different than when it has 2,000, and that's changed with time. But we were in a business that was very male-dominated, very egotistical driven. People thought about aesthetic in ways that was much more about showing off and showing pride, not showing comfort and coziness. Yeah. So we just had an industry that felt it needed a lot of tweaks, both from a design perspective, from an approach to the resident perspective. And we've just been on that ever since, right? And to me, it's about staying true to that person, and as she evolves and what she needs in her lifestyle approaches, we evolve to an extent. And then other people come alongside that. But I felt it was a very underserved customer base within the general population, which is really wanting something better. And so we're really just following that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that idea of it being this ever-evolving product. I think that's so true of what we're seeing now. But it'd be great, obviously you've had 7 years in the industry, how to take a look back to say how you've seen it evolve up to this point and the main kind of key milestones that you feel like co-living has achieved, only as of late but beforehand too.
Yeah, I think co-living for most started as a boutique, smaller micro community concept. It could have been anything from, we had these walk-ups in Brooklyn, literally 6 units, 15 residents, communal spaces in them. We've seen other people have like homes, right, where what they call an HMO here, where you have like a house and there's 5 or 6 bedrooms in it and you're sharing. And that was I don't even know if that was 1.0. That was like 0.5 of the concept that we had. But it worked because there were some people who liked to live in that. And then on the other extreme, you've got very large scale formats where you're more studio led. You have your own private bathroom, a place to work from home, a small unit, but then you have all these amenities at your doorstep. And that's maybe 3.0 where we're going to. And then there's just in between all these other concepts that sort of you can play with different amounts of people, different locations, how your amenity mix works, depending on what city you're in and how urban or rural you got. So you've got everything in between, and that's how we see that's evolved. I think there's another evolution, which is like the investor class evolution. Yeah. So starting as, how did this industry start? Most of my peers in 2016, very few of them are in existence today, unfortunately, because it was a hard thing. They were people onto an interesting idea. They made it work at a small scale. That really worked well at small scale. It had soul, it had energy, but there was a real challenge in scaling that. And some of them, there wasn't enough buildings for them to find, or they took venture capital money and that didn't really work out. They couldn't grow into that sort of trajectory quite as much. So it's a bit of a marathon race too. It's less of a sprint. It's more of a marathon. We find in this thing, you just want to stick to it and be around because the long-term opportunities are there. So the industry's changed too. I think now there's more institutional investor interest that we probably didn't even have.
I agree.
Pre-pandemic, I think when pandemic happened, everyone's like, was everyone going to just move away from living together because, everyone's going to social distance or something like that. And that sort of quickly flipped its head. And people came back to cities wanting that connection, realized they don't want to be on a Zoom call for their whole life. And that's really getting interesting. So I think now we're in this institutionalized, it's still early stage. It's led by more the value add, opportunistic, venture type of institutions. But I think over time, it's going to be viewed as an affordable product for young people in cities that's doing great for attracting talent to young people in cities, hitting the price point they need, and then also just allowing people to integrate better. If you're having all these people in cities for 2-3 years, just like you have students, you want them to be part of it, not the transient, because it's a constant transient, medium-term transient flow of people, and you want to harness that. And so I think cities are more and more coming on board. We're getting mayors at the opening shovel ceremonies and things like that for our buildings because they're just seeing the value and where that's going. So I think that's really exciting where we're going through this phase of starting at a very micro idea in a garage almost type of thing to something much larger scale that global investors are getting interested in.
Well, I think what's really interesting from my perspective, obviously being more on the student housing side, is there's so much liquidity in the student sector, but ultimately the co-living sector appeals to many more people from a demographic perspective. Actually, the risk of people living in your buildings and having voids and that type of thing is so much less if you're investing in the right neighborhoods like Brixton, some of the locations that you've got in Spain, like the US, where if you are in the best location in the best cities, then ultimately people are going to want to live there because there's just not access to residential units. Whereas I think sometimes in student, it's an amazing asset class. There's a massive undersupply, but it only taps into one element of the population who might live there for 1, maximum 2 or 3 years. Whereas I think co-living actually can in time evolve into something that's a much more medium-term housing solution rather than being a short-term housing solution.
Yeah, and this idea of what people are also calling flex living now. It's a type of it, but it's just providing that turnkey solution in the rental market, but with a bit more of these elements is a word more and more people are replacing in the institutional world. Instead of calling it co-living, they call it flexible living, just because it's easier to understand. It sounds a little less like a fad that started or something like that. That went
something like that.
Yeah. But people have been living like this for years. We've had boarding houses for centuries. Yeah. We've had people live in a 300 square foot private sort of mini apartment and then having communal spaces around them. That's, we have monastic. It's just in Spain. We've had these things for a long time. They kind of work. They've been around. It's not that new. It's just we have 1 gig Wi-Fi in ours. So it's a little different.
Wi-Fi, communal kitchens and everything else.
Yep. It's like people get hung up, I think, on that kind of co-living and the terminology. But you're right. I think that is really evolving now to represent what this actually means as an asset class. And it's not just, it can be studio living, it can just be in a way quite a similar product to BTR. There are similarities with PBSA, but it doesn't need to be, to a specific form, because as you say, there are so many different varieties where it could be more boutique, one's larger scale, one hones in, as you say, on an eco element. So it's such a broad variety that it's almost difficult to bring it or isolate it all down to that one kind of co-living term. And coming back to what Jamie said as well about the demographic appeal, like you're absolutely right, that because you can also have students, and I think that's what people miss out as well, is that you can have people that are students all the way up to retired people. I know you have someone that's retired at Brixton. It's amazing to see how they really all come together in this kind of multi-generational community. And then you've got younger people who perhaps just finishing being students or are students, but they're doing postgraduate degrees and they don't feel as though they want doing a PhD or something like that. They don't feel like they want to be in student halls again. They feel more mature. They want a maturer product that represents that phase of life. So actually the demographic appeal is so wide, and people come together in such a really like wholesome way to live together. And I think that's such a nice thing that you've particularly been able to achieve in Brixton as well.
I think just going quickly back to the point around this kind of female focus strategy, I think that's so interesting because the real estate sector, as you say, has historically been, it's a bit better now, but is still dominated by male focused thinking. And it's refreshing to hear that you're appealing to a female focused demographic when it comes to the buildings. And I would love to hear a bit more about that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's really comes down to how to make it feel like a home. Like I ask our residents, like, why did you move in? And they said it felt like home. And then you unpack home. What is that? It's like you show up and it smells nice and it feels welcoming and the lighting feels soft and like just the way people say hi to me is great. And then I would have designed it this way. And this is the kind of way I want to interact with the people around me. I'm comfortable. And so I think going through that journey of how a lot of our female residents have experienced it, because a lot of times they're more in tune with that way of thinking, has really helped us navigate through. And just by focusing on that, it's just you don't have those blind spots that you might think with more of that linear thinking that you have more traditionally. So that's really all it is. It's a simple kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes type of mentality. Make sure there's enough places for their shoes in the units, which is a problem with a lot of co-living buildings that have a very tiny closet. So make sure we have good storage space, etc. There's a lot of guys who have 20 pairs of shoes these days. So it's not, there's no gender stereotyping anymore. You know, I think it's just more of that soft-side approach, right, of just thinking through it, and that lifestyle approach, again, that thinking through, that's what we unpacked.
And how do you feel like you've been able to use the data of your live schemes to be able to really hone and optimize the product as much as possible to get to this point? What do you feel like the key kind of learnings have helped evolve the product?
Yeah, so there's data in different ways that is unique for us because we're in multiple markets and we've had probably assets operating in multiple markets more than most people. It's a few things. One, global data and comparing things and comparing trends. Yeah. How similar are people? How different? Where are they different and why? I think that's been fascinating to look at it and pick up on trends of what's similar that customers want around the world, what's different about them, timing of things, seasonality, etc. So there's been a lot of rich data in just thinking, oh, when we launched in Dublin versus London versus Barcelona versus New York versus Seattle versus LA, like what was different, what was similar, what happened, and what are the trends we're seeing and the customer preferences we're seeing change? Are we picking up something on one market and then it shows up later? So I think having that advantage, it's a little like Back to the Future sometimes with these things. Like you're in one city and you're like, oh, this is what it was like. And then you see it happen in another city. So we get a bit of that advantage of seeing it, and it can help us predict things. Because, you know, sometimes innovation comes sideways. You see it in another market and it comes here. You see it in another industry and it comes there. So I think that global side gives us a lot of really rich data, both just aggregating, comparing, benchmarking. How long does it take to launch a project? How long does it take to lease? Is it different? And understanding those nuances in different markets being very helpful. And then you flip that on the other side is the uber granular data. I think just having this approach that's very customer driven, like getting into the real nitty gritty of design. Do we cater to their specific lifestyles, everything they need? If you think about a resident, the day in the life of who works at home 2 days a week, and how you go through that, and where's all their stuff, and when are they going to go to the gym in their building, and when are they going to do, you know, their Zoom calls and all of that, and thinking through that helps us get another set of data that's very specific. So and the feedback loop we get from our design studio is great as well. So we have a group of designers that work in house, and so we get that feedback loop from all our projects around the world. So we could say, hey, there was this really great amenity space in Dublin, or everyone loves that bed or that closet or the way we organize some element of a room. And we get that feedback loop, and then we can see, can we apply that to a new market or the next project? And so we're iterating there. So this data we get both, it's not just operational data, it's design data, it's customer experience data, it's macroeconomic data, it's trend data. There's a lot of things, even politics, like we just watch what happens in one market versus the other. Oh, are they going to introduce these kind of rules or that kind of rules? And because we have our toes in these things, we can say, do we think Berlin will go the way of San Francisco, or this will go the way of that, or whatever trend's happening? So yeah, there's just different ways to slice the data, and that's exciting to us, looking at different ways from an uber granular level to a super kind of global level.
And do you feel like there's like common traits or common threads, and like humans behave quite similarly across markets? Or are you seeing that actually each individual market is quite distinct and you're having to do really different propositions to get people excited?
It's a great question. So I do believe there's kind of one humanity of like Maslow's needs. So people want to connect. They want to meet people. They want to have also a quiet place to stay and relax and do that. So there's a human experience that's very similar and aspirational, our residents. People then execute urban living in different cities slightly differently. And so we have to cater to that. And the way cities allow you to build buildings, you have to adapt to that in certain cities.
Right.
There's more of a concept that, yes, people want certain ways, but it does manifest itself differently. Some people live in America because they want more space. Everything might be just 1.3 times bigger because that's what you do in Texas, for example, right? Versus, say, Barcelona, right? So there's different ways you execute. But I would say that there's a lot more similarities than difference in the customer wants, but there's a lot more differences in how you execute that locally to get the customer what they want. So it's not like the hotel industry where it's like, oh, everyone realizes we need hotels. We have a hotel zoning for hotels. People want to stay. We get that. And every country has a hotel zone. And you're a hotel operator, owner, investor. You come in, say, I'm just looking for a hotel site or building, and you can do that. You want to come into a concept of, okay, some shared spaces, some private spaces, and you say, okay, great. I want to have the ability to have 80% of my units studios and then some ones and then this. And in every city, you'll have a different rule book, whether you can do that or not. And you'll have a different use class of how you can do that or not. And so there'll all be these different rules. And are you commercial? Are you residential? So how you execute on that vision is very different by market.
And if there's one thing that you had to put in every single city, what would that be?
Great people. It's tugging that. But from a physical side, you always need at least one indoor space for communal area and one outdoor space for communal area. I really like that. There's the fresh air, whether it's a roof terrace or a courtyard or something like that. You need a place where people can convene and have that outdoor kind of relaxing. And then you need a multi-use space inside. Then when you get into the units, that's where it can be really different by residence, what market you're in, where you, like you said, you want the Texas big, do you want something smaller? There's lots of different variety in the unit mix that you can do, because some people we found just want a one-bed apartment, but they just like the ethos and like to be in a more activated environment. And some people might be on a small budget where they're like, but they don't want to be in their own micro unit. Let's say they want to share with 2 or 3 people. Just there's a little bit of a smaller mini community they can be with. So you get some of those. So I think you offer all of those different types of units depending on the market where you're there, but then it comes down to where do you convene, where do you program that? And then I think what's also in all of our buildings, we have our Node app, we have like people digitally connecting, because it creates a place you come digitally that then wraps around the physical. So if you're not in the building, you're still part of the community because you're checking, is there an event happening or this is going on, or chatting with some people, or just using it for that. So also that's something that's a real part, like getting the tech to tie the people together and create like an online presence that you feel you're part of when you come to. That's a real important part as well.
And comparing the UK co-living market, which is in its kind of early evolution process, how do you think that compares to that of the US and Europe that have been doing this for many more years than we have? And where do you think we are in that growth journey, having seen it evolve more elsewhere?
I think actually the UK is going to, outside of Asia, which we haven't talked about, because I think there's a bunch happening there.
Yeah.
I think the UK is actually going to lead the way on this going forward. It's still a bit complicated. It's subject to politics.
Yeah.
But if you can get these built, I think in cities like London that are international, where people want this, where we've seen it work with scale, we have larger scale. Probably the most valuable co-living buildings are now coming up in London because of the price per foot they are, and some of them are larger scales. So I do think London will be a really strong market. It's still really scattered in the US. It's been there, but it hasn't really gotten institutional acceptance yet of scale. There's not large scale, 300, 500, 800. There's not a lot of them. There's a few of them. So I think actually the UK is good. I think Madrid's really interesting too. I think we're seeing a lot there. It's a very big market that we're active in. It feels like there's visibility on zoning, the ability to get things there done. There's real demand. Wages are low. There's lots of people care about price points. So I think it's got a lot of elements. And I think in Asia, it's actually, in some ways, they're going to lead the way. Like they're used to cities with 15 million people.
Yeah.
I was in Bangalore. My heritage is Indian. I go to India every once in a while. I help Blackstone set up our India office. So I've been experienced there. And I saw what happened in the office revolution there of when the world was flat and all these tech companies were putting back offices or actually innovation centers in cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune. There's a big co-living movement there because they haven't had generationally young people move to cities like that, be on their own. Where do they go? So there's a huge need, and there's like millions of people. So I think India is going to be one of the biggest co-living markets in the world, as is China. So we're going to see, I think they're going to have, by volume, significantly bigger demand. China is the only one where you have 1 million plus residents in a co-living company. We're not anywhere near that today. So I think Asia is an interesting market for the concept too. It just shows there is global appeal in a lot of these markets.
It was interesting as well, like when obviously Jenna mentioned the UK, you mentioned London. Are you feeling that London is where the co-living market is going to really be successful? Clearly London is the key driver of economic activity in the UK. But are you looking at some of the regional locations like Manchester, Bristol, Brighton as options, or is that at the moment a stretch too far and London is where everyone needs to be focusing?
No, I think there are opportunities in those markets. They're smaller markets, and it really depends on investor appetite. I think when you think about new concepts in the market and you think it's early days, it's sometimes good to go with one thing new and a few things that are familiar, right? When you're innovating in real estate. So it's, I like London. I get London. You have to convince me of London. But I got to try something a little, and I realize I can't really invest in residential because the yields don't work. The numbers aren't stacking up in BTR with high interest rates and construction costs. So I want to get into the people living in London play, and co-living works. I think once investors get comfortable with that, and then they say, I get this, I bought into it. I can get a premium going to those other cities where I see similar demographics. Subject to the politics of those cities, some of them are going to allow this, some of them aren't. There will be opportunities in there, but they might be a little smaller. And I think it's the first port of calling, and then you go out. But that's really following the money. Right? It doesn't mean following the customer, that there aren't customers in all these residential cities that want this, that haven't had it yet. So I do think there's pent-up demand in some of these other areas. And it's just urban living. Like it doesn't really restrict itself necessarily to it, but it might be right-sized for the market, the scale of the market, the size of the units. You have to think about what's around you and what's your relative proposition to it. So if you can get a really big flat for cheap in Birmingham, you'll go to a co-living thing because you want these other things, this community, etc. But you'll still try and create a product that's a discount to that same big flat that they have. So someone will say, okay, I'm still getting that value prop, etc. So the rules still apply. They're just not as acute, and you might have more people on the lifestyle. They just like to live that way more than actually it's a bit more of a necessity where people, if they want something new and institutionally run and clean and professionally managed, co-living might be your only option.
Yeah, the severe need of co-living apartments in general in London.
So in terms of designing co-living, I think this is a really interesting one. We touched on it before about studio living, how BTR and co-living are perhaps blending into one another a bit more. And I think your business model is a really interesting one for this, because integrating studios and one beds and then some two beds within the same product is an incredibly innovative take on co-living. And it also means, I think, that people are able to stay within the buildings as long as possible, and you cater for the different phases of life that they might experience in kind of 3 years or 5 years, getting a promotion, going from a studio to a one bed, maybe wanting more space, and then going to a two bed. Because I think that is often a criticism of co-living, is how long do people actually stay in studios. So the fact that Node has this different concept is a really interesting one, and I wonder what inspired that.
Well, I think it's just viewing living as stages of life, right?
Yeah.
And so I take it back even further. I think there's a student living stage. There's obviously home with mom and dad, and then there's a student living stage. Then there's a early stage career, or I don't need a lot of space because I'm living more urban stage of life. So you could put co-living, micro-living that. Then there's a bit more, okay, I'm getting a bit on my own. I've got my bearings. I want a bit more private space, BTR, multifamily. And then you've got senior living, then you've got assisted living. So there's this whole spectrum that you're in. But I do think that because co-living feeds into BTR, it will naturally encroach that way, but it'll also encroach in grad students because some grad students might not want to be in a complete student res. They're a bit grown up. Their friends are working, and hey, I'm in medical school. I don't need the 19-year-olds.
Beyond that type thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you're going to see catering on both ends to a bit of those grad student types, and definitely people who could live in a BTR building, but actually say, I like the activation of this space. And so to have a product that can take them through that journey, that's a price point wise, where actually, in my view, it's you have the more compact studio as your entry-level product, or even in some markets, you have a cluster. That's an entry-level product. Before that, you're sharing a 3-bed or 4-bed apartment. Then you have your own private space and a kind of compact studio. Then you have a large studio, you have a 1-bed, and then you have a 2-bed. That's a good journey that you could probably do for 20 years. So the longevity, if we could get buildings where you were allowed to do that, and it really does vary by city and municipality, we would do that. We've taken a different approach in Dublin, for example, where we have a co-living building that's opening that's much more studio-led. But then the next one after that is going to be 1, 2, and 3 beds, but it's very close by. So our view is like almost like a campus. Hey, you could come here, but if you want that other space options, go there. Yep. But we've looked at some opportunities where we say, why don't we do part of the floor is co-living and part of the floor is like traditional multifamily? Because again, then you could have that longevity in your building and have an entry price point for someone. And you think about young working professionals, right? They usually double their salaries in the first 5-6 years of their career, right? So price for one level and then be able to accommodate for another level makes a lot of sense to me if they're going to stay put in that next career jump move. Otherwise, you just lose them every time they move up the ladder.
Yeah, and they become this kind of brand advocate if they really love living there. And as you say, there's so much movement in the early part of a career from where you start, hopefully acceleration, and then it does create this kind of gap because not everyone wants to buy. Most people don't want to buy anymore, but they want to be in these managed communities. So if you have had a really positive experience living at a concept like Node, then it makes perfect sense that you could then move into an accommodation that caters more towards the needs that are updated throughout your life and certainly the early part of your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was at a conference actually last week and they were talking about design, and someone said that design of a co-living building is the hardware, but the community is the software. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a really nice way of putting it. And I just wondered how you design your buildings in order to inspire that community. And I think it's something that is often talked about in co-living, but actually going to Brixton and seeing how people really do interact with one another and really have this kind of rich friendship. And I was speaking to someone and they said they'd gone on holiday together with a group of them, and creating that is really unique. So I wonder how design feeds into that community aspect.
It's a whole ecosystem, so it's a huge part of it, right? That's why we have an in-house design studio. We don't just go to we work with architects, interior designers, but we protect because you're trying to keep that glue together, all those learnings from projects, etc. Design is super important because you want to create spaces that are aspirational, that foster community, that cater to a certain demographic or lifestyle. And so how the building feels physically, it looks physically is really important to that. It has to be practical too. You have to think through, okay, someone's life, 27 years old, in a studio, what are they doing and how does that work? What kind of gym would they like? What kind of thing? All these aesthetics have to really line up. So it's a hugely important thing. And if you get the design right, then you're appealing to the right type of people. Then the people come. And then when you have these people who come and they're all aligned, then they obviously want to mix and mingle. And that's where you bring in tech, you bring in the way, you make it contagious. Like what we found is it's really organic too. You put yourself out there and people buy into the ethos, the mission, the values of what you're trying to do. And it self-selects things and then they tell their friends and then word gets out and it becomes this organic movement. But you have to have the physical there. But you can't have the hardware without the software. You can't have the software without the hardware. So I like that analogy for sure. And you literally need the tech software to put it together, because how you create community, it's, yes, you physically design it. One thing I think that's lacking, and because a lot of times we partner with developers, and so they bring us projects or sites, and they've had some architect, but we have to spend a lot of time optimizing those designs, curating them, bringing a bit more soul to it, making the units more practical, getting more out of the same box that they do. So you have to spend 3 times as much time designing a co-living studio than a build-to-rent apartment, because you have more space there. You can just throw a closet in there. Any furniture type will fit because it's got enough room. When you're co-living, every square centimeter, inch counts. And if you have it off by a little bit, the whole thing, the room doesn't work, because you're trying to get everything to work, right? Everything has to fit.
You've got to work really hard to get there.
Yeah, and sometimes people don't realize how much effort it is to do that. So it's a lot more work to do that. And that's where I think you do have to be a specialist, have that feedback loop, have all that data. So that's super important to go into design. All that feeds into the right people, all that feeds into the right community.
Yeah. I thought that was also a really interesting part when we were going around Brixton, was actually going into the rooms and saying, how big do you think this room is? And a colleague of mine were like, 40 square meters or something. And they came back and they're like, no, like 26 square meters or 24 square meters, because it's so designed, it actually appears and feels a lot bigger than it actually is. And I think also speaking to the residents, what also came through, which was really interesting, is that they don't feel like there's not enough space. They actually comment on the space as a positive thing, that they have enough space to put all their stuff, that they don't feel claustrophobic, which is a really amazing feedback when these are smaller units.
Yeah, and it's quality, not quantity, is the way I look at it. It's about that quality of space. People always say, what size unit you do? I was like, dimensions matter. Natural light matters. There's a lot of things that can make something really open up.
Windows.
Exactly.
Storage.
Exactly. So all of these things make a huge difference, that you'd much rather have a beautiful 30 square meter apartment than a schleppy 50, right? If it had everything you need, it feels really nice. It can feel more aspirational. It feels smarter. It caters to exactly it kind of caters to your intuition. Oh, that's exactly where I would have put that type of thing. And that's what you have to do with the design. And that's why it's very involved. Look, we've designed 27 buildings, 9 cities. We get that, and we designed every single one of them, and every project we've worked on, we've only designed. So we only put our name to things that we've been quite involved in that design process, and that's where I think our partners bring us in. They say, look, we could take a kind of stab at it, but actually all these pieces have to fit together, right? You can't just start renting a product if the product's not quite right, or talk about that. So it's usually important.
Do you find a real correlation between the community and how strong the community is at any given building and how long people actually stay in the buildings?
Yeah, I think, look, it's still early days in some of the communities, but absolutely people are happy they stay longer for sure. But that's not the only measure, because I do think that sometimes people are there for a year to 2 years regardless. It's a work assignment, but they really want to invest. So I think the strength of it is also over time is your kind of referral rates, and we do NPS tracking and things like that. And are people still, or our alumni, so we have Node alumni, we call our residents Nodies, they call themselves Nodies. They have all these Nodies around, and years later, they're still referring their friends in. That's a good sign that you've done a great job, because it is a transient part of life, your 20s or 30s. Most people in urban cities are in transition, right? So I think the proof in the pudding is also just like how many people come back, how many people tell their friends about it after they've left, and that can be pretty powerful too.
Obviously, the name of the podcast is Reinventing Real Estate. So that's why we love to talk about innovation, what's going on, how people like yourselves are disrupting the marketplace. And I think it's really interesting to hear about what innovations you're now putting into the buildings, whether that's tech, whether that's design, how you're taking it to the next level.
Yeah, I think tech's going to have a bigger and bigger portion of it, putting sensors in rooms, having sensors for utility usage and making residents aware of that so they can optimize space, having a digital overlay as well as a physical overlay for sure. It can help us be more efficient managers. It can drive more to the bottom line as well. Use the real people that are human contact and have others that aren't giving that human touch. We can centralize that through technology. So I think there's a bunch of tech that's going to go into it. I think buildings are changing. The fabric of buildings are changing. There's been a lot of talk about modular construction. It hasn't really got off the ground as well in the UK, although we do have one of the largest co-living buildings in the world that's in London that is modular. So that's encouraging. So I think it's the hardware and the software that you're going to see things innovate. We also see like a global movement. We're a little different that way. We see an opportunity. The idea of node is to connect. So we thought of ourselves as a network, a point of connection, right? And we see a way of actually, by having these different geographical nodes, as an interesting way to build one of the first global platforms that does this, both as an operator, as a designer, as an asset manager, picking up on those trends. So it's not all just in the build and taking those ideas to other markets, right? So that's one way that we're trying to push the envelope a little bit as well.
Nice. I think that idea around global is quite rare, even in the living communities, even in some of the more mature sectors like BTR and student housing. So it is a really fascinating space to be in. And as you say, it's all about learning from other markets and introducing things that people are surprised and delighted by and get to understand and get to benefit from, because ultimately people living in New York probably have very similar strains to people living in London, or people living in London have similar strains to people in Madrid. So it's about being influenced, but in a positive way.
Yeah, and when you think about real estate, I think you have to choose. You either are a local specialist, or you're a sector specialist, right?
Yeah.
So we're a sector specialist. So geography, we can take our sector specialism to other geographies. But the only way we can execute that is then finding local specialists and partners that we can execute with locally. It's not different to what hotel companies do. You have a global brand. Some hotel companies are in 90 countries, right? But they always work with local sector specialists to execute, but they bring in that industry knowledge. So I think we're on a similar path. There's a similar journey there. I think we're picking up on journeys from student housing. I was quite involved in that in my past, and seeing that sector evolve and becoming global. And yeah, we're just excited about what lies ahead.
Just getting more into that kind of global aspects, I think that's incredibly unique. What are your kind of target locations globally and domestically? Where do you see that node network going?
Yeah, we see it going where there's real need and an institutional, what I'll call apartment, multifamily, BTR market. So if there's cities where we know there is need for and a bit of a formed investor institutional market for multifamily, they become markets that we can go, because we think you need the investor interest in the traditional resi to then say, hey, I'm going to try alternative resi, right? So that does guide us to some extent. And then sometimes it's driven by where our partners want to go. Sometimes it's a little opportunistic, frankly. So we have a top-down approach where we say, okay, where there's need. So we've been in the Londons, the Dublins, the Madrids. There's some of the bigger ones. There's a few other markets that we definitely think in Western Europe that see a lot of demand, but it's having the right execution partner to deliver. Like we like the Netherlands. There's regulations there. There's all sorts of things. So you have to navigate that. We like Paris as a market. So that's somewhere interesting. We think there's a few markets in Asia that are going to be interesting over time, like the Australias, the Indias, et cetera. We have an eye out, but we take things step by step. We're in year 7, going to year 8. That's the 30-year plan. We don't want to stretch ourselves too thin. We think there's plenty of opportunity, even in the markets we've just started, to really grow. So frankly, we're more invested in actually doubling down in the markets we do. And then we'll strategically add a market as we think the right stars align. It's a bit of a right partner, right opportunity, right timing. But I think what's under our nose is actually more interesting right now, and actually just executing on building from where we are.
And then obviously you just said before about node being kind of sector specialist. Does that mean that there wouldn't be aspiration going forward moving into any of the other living sectors? Is it the expansion is going to be co-living but globally?
Yeah, I think we want to stay to our knitting. We were early days student housing when I was at Blackstone. That industry's matured. There's players there. I think where we can really play well is in this emerging sector where we can bring something different to the table, be differentiated and really be there. So I think we're going to stick to our knitting. I just see that co-living will in and of itself evolve and become more mainstream and gobble up a little bit of that grad student market and gobble up a bit of that entry-level build-to-rent market.
Definitely.
So we'll definitely be penetrating into those two markets just as co-living as a offer becomes flexible living and it's a little less defined by it's just got a bit of a wider remit. That will definitely play into it, and in that way we'll do it. But I don't think we're going to, people, we have a lot of some node residents like, oh, where's my node? I'm a senior. The parents come to us like, are you going to do a node seniors? I'm like, not for 20 years. Maybe when I'm in my mid 60s, I'll do it. But no, we want to stay focused. And we're onto something, hone it, live it, breathe it every day, stay there. And if someone says, I really like what you're doing, but can you come to our market too and execute on that? That's a way that we can expand. But I think we stay to what we do. We stay to that same resident experience, the same story with a resident, what they go through. And we just evolve with that, just keep up with what we need to do to innovate just in co-living, which is moving.
And then building on that, how do you see the co-living sector evolving over, say, the next decade? And what role do you see Node playing in shaping that future?
Co-living is definitely going global. So we see ourselves as being one of the first global players to actually execute on that global strategy. It's going more institutional. We're unique that, yes, we're a bit of a startup, 7 years, but we come from institutional backgrounds. We get what institutions need, whether it's the banks, the insurance companies, the investors. So we want to be part of that institutionalized journey. We don't have to be the first person in the market, but we'd love to be one of the institutionalizers of the market. And that helps everyone, because if we can help be part of that because we have that experience as being one of the peers in the market, there's other peers in the co-living industry that bring other really great innovations. But if we can be on the part of that institutionalization, we're used to working with large-scale investors. We get what they want. We know how to translate things for them. That just opens up the sector for more people. That just makes the sector bigger. That makes it more resilient. Everyone wins from that, right? So we definitely want to be part of that, work with our peers, but work together in doing that. And that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, like data. People want data. You don't institutionalize without data. The reason why cost of capital goes down is people look back and say, how did things perform? Oh, they performed okay. Okay, that's lower risk. Okay, that's lower return. That's higher prices. I can feel comfortable, right? So we need to be part of that as well.
So if you could reinvent just one aspect of the real estate sector, which frankly there's a lot of areas that one could, but if it's just one area of the real estate sector, what do you think you would choose?
I would say how institutional capital is formed and grouped. I don't think it's really conducive to building housing in cities the way we're going to need to keep up with the demand. The way it's viewed, construction's really risky, therefore it has to be really expensive. And so we've made building housing as one of the most expensive things because of how we've set up our real estate industry, where if you build something that's really high risk, it goes to a certain bucket with a certain fund. And that's actually making viability of a lot of things go down. Yeah. When we all know when these things are open, they run at 99, 98% occupancy. There's so much demand and it's really strong. And so I do think there's a bit of a broken capital market piece here, and that's going to cause bigger problems than we think. If you have to borrow at 10% and give investors returns of 15 to 20%, we're doing that as an industry, great. But imagine if we could do it at a subsidized rate, how many more homes would get built?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. And it's, as you say, that kind of more archaic way of raising capital and more looking at buying 15-year office leases in central London or major cities around the world, and how that now needs to change to adapt to the new reality that we're in, because frankly everywhere, most places in the world have housing shortages. There's got to be a capital catch-up of allocating construction and allocating housing in a maybe different way, and maybe not targeting such aggressive concepts when it comes to that. So I think that's a really interesting one for sure.
Yeah, and the second one is the planning system, because it's not clear. It takes time to innovate in cities and come up with different zoning concepts and living concepts. People are thinking in generational terms when they're coming up with policies. But we don't have the right policies in place generally for housing. We don't have enough density bonuses for trying new concepts. The affordable housing criteria doesn't really work. It actually discourages housing get built. It doesn't encourage housing get built. It makes it harder for more supply to come. So there's a lot of things in there, and you have to really tackle it on every level. You need cities to give you the ability of, if you're creating rental housing at these price points, we'll let you build more of it. You need banks to say, we'll give you better deals, not worse deals, because you're building. You need investors to take a different view. They keep talking about ESG and all these things. I'm like, you're building a housing that's affordability, et cetera. Why are you charging the highest rate of return within your investment portfolio for building this if you're so conscious about it, right? So it's not really adding up. True. So I think you need all these levers to turn. And there have been markets where that works. If you can get more attractive financing because you're doing the right thing, if you can get more density out of a land plot because you're doing the right thing and help in the solution, then a lot more projects can pencil and we can deal with this supply issue.
And then I suppose just looking at Node more generally, and obviously, every year comes a lot of expansion, a lot of newness, a lot of additional strategies, but really with that goal of co-living at the heart. Where do you see Node in 10 years' time? And do you have a kind of aspiration to get to a certain level by 2034, for example?
I think we see ourselves as a global asset manager, operator, designer of these products, right? So that's our global aspiration. How many markets that means in the end, I don't know. You look at companies like Greystar that manage 2 million units, and our asset managers have funds in different geographies and countries. If we can be a sliver of that, but be super focused rather than a mass market provider, but a specialist, but saying actually we can provide investment opportunities for our investors in multiple geographies, different risk spectrums for them in different geographies, give our customers at the same time this great network, because as we've grown, they can be in any city in the world or any of the key cities they think they'd want to live in, and say, actually, when I get my job or get my job transferred, I'm going to go to the next node where I go. That would be a great place to be in 2040.
I look forward to seeing that. And thank you so much, Anil, for joining us today on the podcast.
It's great to be here.